theory was alienating for me. It was associated with seemingly arbitrary rules, and all wrapped up in an off-putting sense of cultural imperialist entitlement. Thanks to a good guitar teacher, I found that not only did jazz theory make sense, it was also very useful. Since then, as a teacher, I've drawn on those experiences to refine my own understanding and develop an approach to introducing jazz theory to beginners. It seems to be effective, so I want to share it with you. This video is about teaching and learning basic chord scale theory in a useful way. If you're a teacher, then for you, I'll be modeling my approach and sequence for teaching these concepts. If you're a student yourself, then it will actually be a lesson for you. Either way, it'll be useful. Hi, I'm Saul Richardson from Jazz Workshop Australia, and welcome to Teaching Jazz for another video about jazz education. A very young John Burks Gillespie, long before he became known as Dizzy, came to a shocking realization that could have stopped his nascent musical career dead. Gillespie had been learning music since early childhood. He'd been exposed to music in his family and in his community. His father was a musician. He learned first trombone before switching to trumpet at about age 12. At school, according to Gillespie and biographer Al Fraser, he'd played in a band run by teacher Alice Wilson, who also gave him some early lessons in improvising and in jazzing tunes. Alice Wilson's contribution to Gillespie was immeasurable, but she wasn't perfect as a teacher. Gillespie's realization came after a reportedly embarrassing failure. He realized that while he only knew how to play in one key, music, in fact, is in many keys. Gillespie realized that he needed some theory. In this video, I'm focusing on chords, where they come from, how to figure out key centers, and things like that. Of course, there are many other aspects of jazz theory, and I'll cover those another time, but students don't need all jazz theory all at once, and nor do they need all of it all the time. For the teachers out there, this lesson shouldn't be for complete jazz beginners. This is very, very important. Don't start a student's jazz journey by talking about theory. You don't need to know any chord scale theory before you start improvising and playing jazz. After a while, when students have started to improvise in key centers and are ready to consolidate and extend their knowledge and their independence, then learning about jazz chords will be useful. Avoid the mistake of thinking that beginners need lots of theory prepared before they start, because they don't. Just get them playing first and then build it up from there. Well, with that said, let's move on to where chords come from and how they're made. The strict definition of a chord is more than two notes played at the same time. But in the real world of people making music, even two notes together can function as a chord, like power chords on guitar, for instance. Basic jazz chords come from notes stacked up one on top of the other in thirds and played at the same time. A third is a type of interval, a measure of distance between musical notes. It's a way of explaining how much higher or lower one note is than another note. I'm going to come back to intervals in a moment, but first you need to know that notes in chords come from scales. In the examples today, I'll use a C major scale, but you could use any scale for this. The reason for that is that a scale is just a pattern of sounds, and every major scale follows the same patterns. And teachers, I know you know this, but remember this is an example of how I present this to jazz beginners. Here's the pattern. If you start on the note C and then play a note a tone higher, also known as a whole step, then go up another tone, then a semitone, also known as a half step, then continue tone, 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 semitone, you'll end up with a major scale. This is the formula for a major scale. Pick a starting note, then go up following the pattern tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. and you'll have a major scale. It doesn't matter what the starting note is, the pattern is always the same. In most scales, you have to use sharps or flats to keep the pattern, which is why most scales have different numbers of sharps or flats in them. C major doesn't need any sharps or flats. Every major scale follows the same pattern, so what I'm going to say about chords using the example of C major applies equally to every other major scale. Now that you have at least a rough idea of what a chord is and how major scales all follow the same pattern as each other, you need to know about scale degree numbers. Each note in a scale can be given a number. The first note is called the first note, the second note is called the second note, the third note is called the third, the fourth note is called Duke Ellington. No, I'm just kidding, it's called the fourth note, the fifth, the sixth, and so on. A major scale has got notes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. In classical music theory, they use other names for notes like tonic, supertonic, mediant, the something else-inant, the this or that-inant, and whatever. Should you learn all those names? Sure, why not? They have their uses, but just not so much for this lesson. Among jazz musicians, only a couple of those traditional names are commonly used. Tonic, meaning the first note of the scale, dominant, meaning the fifth note of the scale, and octave, meaning the eighth note of the scale. If a scale goes up more than one octave, you can actually keep counting. The octave is 8, 9, 10, 11, and so on. Those higher numbers can act as a sort of measurement of distance above the note that the scale started on. Now that you've seen how the notes in a scale can be numbered, we can go back and have a closer look at intervals, the distances between notes, because they're really important for understanding the differences between types of chord, like what makes a major or a minor chord, or a dominant 7, for example. Remember that an interval is a measurement of distance from one note to another, and also that intervals can measure distance up or down. Here's how you figure out an interval. Always start by counting the note you're measuring from as 1. In intervals, there's no 0, so wherever you start, count that as 1. So you include the note you're counting up from or down from. For example, if you start on the first note, in this case C, and count 1, 2 up to the second note of the scale, that interval of 2 notes is called a second. The distance from note 1 to note 3 is 3. That interval is called a third. From note 2 to note 4 is also 3 notes, and that interval is also a third. And here are some other examples of counting up a third. Thirds aren't the only type of interval, of course. There are others like fourths, fifths, sixths, and sevenths. An interval of 8 notes is an octave. Having seen what intervals are, now you need to know how they're related to building chords. So next, we'll use your understanding of intervals to see how chords are built and what types of chord you can build. Remember I said earlier that basic jazz chords come from piling up notes one on top of the other in thirds? Here's what that means. You pick a starting note from a scale, add a note from the same scale a third higher than that, then a note a third above that, and so on. This is called harmonizing the note, and it will give you a chord. To get the basic jazz chords, you select notes from whichever scale you're harmonizing. In my example here, I'm making chords from C major, so I won't be using any notes from outside that scale. Here's the note C with the note E, which is a third higher in the C major scale. Here's a C major scale with every note harmonized in thirds. We're going to build a chord up from each note in the scale. Here are some examples. I'll explain more about these in just a moment. Let's take a closer look at those chords and some more really important patterns that emerge when you harmonize a scale by building a chord on top of each note in the scale. Every chord has a name, and the first part of its name comes from whatever note it's built up from. This is often called the root note of the chord, its letter name. The chord built on C will be called C. The chord built on the note D will be called D, and so on. The root note of a chord is its letter name. Now look at this. Here's a C major scale harmonized in thirds again. Now each chord is labeled with the root note, its letter name, plus MAJ, which stands for major, or MIN, which stands for minor. C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, B minor. The word major is usually shortened when it's written down to either MAJ or just MA. And often, to make it look cleaner and more clear, people might even leave out the word major altogether. The word minor, when it's written down, is typically shortened to MIN, MI, or just lowercase m, as in this example. Here's that scale again harmonized into thirds. Notice that some of them are called major and some are called minor. Why? Well, even though they're all thirds, they aren't all exactly the same as each other because of the pattern of tones and semitones that makes up the major scale. There are actually two different types of thirds. One, like the distance from C to E, is two tones, two whole steps. Others, like the distance from D to its third, F, are only 1.5 tones, or 1.5 steps. Some thirds are bigger than others. Another word for big is major, and another word for small is minor. The big thirds, two whole tones, are called major, and the small thirds, 1.5 tones, are called minor. The size of the third when you build up a chord helps determine the name of the chord. If a chord has a minor third, it will be called minor. If it has a major third, it'll be called major. So to recap, major thirds are a semitone or half step bigger than minor thirds, and that's because of the pattern of tones and semitones that make a scale. And for the same reason, there are also major and minor fifths and sevenths as well, as we'll see in just a moment. But first, we need to keep building our chord. To make the most basic type of chord, we need to add at least one more note to the root note and third that we've already got. Keeping in mind that chords are made of notes piled up in thirds, then the new note will be a third above the one we currently have on top. Here's what that looks like. Starting from C, I had C and E, so I added G on top of that because it's a third above E. I'm going through this a bit faster with you than if I was teaching a beginner. With them, I might spend a bit more time and ask them to figure some of these things out for themselves. What note should I add on top of this chord to make a triad? What note should I add here? And so on. By the way, do you see that if a note is on a line, a third higher is the next line, and if a note's on a space, a third higher is the next space up the stave. And if you're teaching this to beginners, that can be a really handy thing to point out. Now we have simple chords made up of 3 different notes. Chords like this are known as triads. Triads are made up of 3 different notes a third apart, like in the examples on the screen now. This is where chords begin, where they come from. Once you have the 3 notes that make up the chord, you can play them in any order, and you can repeat them any number of times, and it doesn't change what that chord is. Most of the basic open string chords that guitarists often play are really just triads or triadic. When I play this open C major chord, I'm obviously playing more than just 3 notes. I'm playing 6 notes, one on each string of the guitar. But the chord only has 3 different notes in it. From lowest to highest note, I'm playing E, C, E, G, C, and E. Repeating notes, or just rearranging them into a different order, doesn't change what the chord is. If you had an absolutely massive continent-sized piano, you could play 150,000 different Cs, 90,000 different Es, and 1 G. That would still just be a C major chord. You can only change what chord it is by adding new musical information, like a different note, or by altering one of the notes in the chord with an accidental. So that's triads, simple chords. But in jazz, we usually go at least one step further and add an extra note to each chord to make them more complex and nuanced. Instead of triads, the most common basic jazz chords are made up of 4 different notes instead of 3. Here's what the basic jazz chords look like when they're born. Each chord now has 4 notes in it and has had the number 7 added to its name. Let's look into that quickly. As an example, I'm using the C major chord built on the first note of the scale. It was made up of C, then E, which is a third higher than C, and then G, which is a third higher again. I added B to the top of that because B is a third higher than G, and chords are made up of notes piled up in thirds. The new extra note, B, is a seventh higher than our C root note. We had a C major triad. I added a note that's a seventh higher than C. So the new chord now changes its name to C major 7. And it's the same for the chords built up from all the other notes in the scale too. The chord built on D was called D minor. I added a note a seventh higher than the root, and now it becomes D minor 7. From now on, I'll just call the new note the seventh. We had an E minor chord. I added its seventh, so it becomes E minor 7, and so on, all the way up the scale. I mentioned earlier that just as there are intervals called major and minor thirds, there are also different sizes of seventh, again due to the pattern of tones and semitones in the major scale. The larger size of sevenths, called major sevenths, are 5½ tones. Smaller sevenths have two common names. They're known as both minor sevenths and flat sevenths. Both names really mean the same thing, but you need to know both terms. And now you do, so you're welcome. If I was explaining this in a lesson to a student or to a class, I'd probably spend a little bit more time on this. But because this is quite a long video, I'll summarize a bit. Firstly, major 7 chords have both a major third and a major seventh in them. Minor 7 chords have a minor third and a minor seventh. When you harmonize the fifth note of a major scale, which is G in our example of a C major scale, you get a unique type of chord that has a major third but a minor seventh. It's major downstairs but minor upstairs. This type of chord borrows its name from classical music note names. It's called a dominant seventh. In classical music, the fifth note of a scale is called the dominant, the unique type of chord you get when you harmonize the dominant, aka the fifth note, is called dominant 7. It's commonly just written as 7, so for instance, G7, C7, F7. Also, when you harmonize the seventh note of a major scale, you get another unique chord type that has a flat 5 as well as a minor third and minor 7. Once again, it's because of the pattern of tones and semitones. The fifth of this chord, and only this chord, has one semitone less than all the other chords. It's called a minor 7 flat 5 chord, and it's also known as half diminished. Now we've got the basic jazz seventh chords. However, in jazz we pretty routinely keep going further and make even bigger chords with 5, 6, or even 7 different notes. These extra notes are known as upper extensions, and to make them we need more than one octave of the scale. Do you remember earlier I said you can keep counting higher beyond the octave? One note higher than the 8th is the 9th, then the 10th, the 11th, the 12th, 13th. Some of these notes can be used to form extended chords. We can take the C major 7 as an example. It's made of notes 1, 3, 5, 7. If we add another third above the 7th, that is the 9th, take C major 7, add the 9th, and it becomes C major 9. Here's the C major scale harmonized into 9th chords. As I mentioned before, once you've built a chord, the notes can be rearranged in any order and repeated. In jazz, another term for rearranging the notes in a chord is voicing. Changing the voicing of a chord doesn't change what chord it is, it just makes it sound different, which is exactly why people do it. Because it would be pretty limiting and boring if each chord only had one sound. To recap so far, we've looked at harmonizing the major scale to build chords. Firstly, 3-note triads, then 4-note 7th chords, and then 5-note 9th chords. We ended up with a pattern of chords. And that leads us to the next essential part of this lesson. Just as every note in the scale can be given a number, chords are given numbers too. The chord built on the first note of the scale is called chord 1. The chord built on the second note of the scale is called chord 2. The chord built on the sixth note of the scale is called chord 6, and so on. You see the pattern. Whatever note number or degree of the scale the chord was built on, it gets that number too. To differentiate between note numbers and chord numbers are written as Roman numerals, and scale degrees are written using regular numbers. In the key of C major, which means using notes from the C major scale, the chords are as follows. Chord 1 is C major 7. Chord 2 is D minor 7. Chord 3 is E minor 7. Chord 4 is F major 7. Chord 5 is dominant 7, almost always just called G7. Chord 6 is A minor 7. And chord 7 is B minor 7, flat 5. Knowing this is very powerful, and before too long it's something that beginners need to learn. Using these chord numbers, we can describe patterns or sequences, usually known as chord progressions, easily and independent of what key they're in. For example, in the key of C major, chord 2 is D minor 7, chord 5 is G7, and chord 1 is C major 7. This pattern is called a 2-5-1 chord progression. Extremely common, prominent, useful to understand, and important for jazz students to know about. 2-5-1 in C major is D minor 7, G7, C major 7. A different chord progression in the key of C could be 1-4-5, C major, F major, G7. The chord numbers allow students to not only begin understanding chord progressions and keys, but also to communicate simply and clearly with other musicians. Often chords will be changed in small ways to make them sound better in relation to the other chords around them. That's a bit more advanced than this video, but it's useful to know, so here's a small example. In that B-flat major chord progression from a moment ago, the G minor 7 chord would usually be changed to a G7 because it sounds better leading into the next chord, the D minor 7. It's almost routine to use a dominant 7 chord as chord 6 instead of a minor 7 in situations like that. In fact, you might find pretty much any chord of the major scale, except for chord 7, turned into a dominant 7th chord. And that's done for reasons of sound or style. Knowing the standard chord scale is a really important beginning. After that, though, with practice and experience, students learn to see relationships between root notes.
I can see that all those root notes are from the key of B flat, even though some of the chords have been changed a bit. Therefore, I could solo in the key of B flat over this progression, using a B flat major blues scale.
Now, if all this sounds a bit complicated, you're right, it is a bit, but remember, if you're teaching this in person in a music lesson, you can spend more time on things and you can tailor your explanations perfectly to the individual needs of the student or to the group. While you might watch this video just once, with students, you should revisit the concepts often and make explicit links between this theory and tunes and exercises that they play. In one-on-one music lessons, the material in this video might take me about half an hour to teach, but then I'd revisit all the concepts explicitly in lots of different ways over the next weeks or even months. Unpack the theory into specific real-life examples and repack examples back up into theory so students can relate them to other instances of the same contexts in multiple and diverse situations. Theory should be used to help students generalize principles between multiple different contexts. Of course, you can go back over any parts of the video that you need to revisit. Take as long as you need. Use this as a resource. Now there's another super useful insight that can come from knowing this chord scale thing, and that is chord families. If you teach or play a chordal instrument like guitar or piano, or a melodic instrument, then knowing about chord families can help you easily to understand complex jazz chord charts. They also give you the power to transform basic mundane chord progressions into exquisite works of art like a jazz master. Chord families are a big topic in their own right, so they're getting their own video, coming soon, not long after this one. So do watch that one next to up your chord game and increase your harmonic understanding. I do hope this is useful for you as a teacher or a student. Please do like and subscribe if you haven't already. Anyway, that's my introduction to jazz theory for beginners. All the best to you. Until next time, bye for now.